Welcome to Tales from the Bridge. In this episode, Kevin and myself sit down with Ray Nayler. Ray is one of my favorite new writers in science fiction. I love his books. There's so much to talk about. We get into some pretty big stuff here, big ideas, because his books are just full of huge ideas. There's so much to think about after you read one of Ray's books. If you have not read any of Ray's books, check out the show notes to a link to his website and where you can find his books. We really appreciate you being here today. All right, let's make our way over to the bridge.
We're so happy to have Ray Nayler with us on the show today. Ray is the author of the critically acclaimed novel The Mountain in the Sea, which won the Locust Award for Best First Novel and was a finalist for the Nebula Award in 2022. His recent novella, The Tusks of Extinction, is a Hugo and Nebula Award finalist for this year. He also has a long list of short fiction, which has been published in Asimov's science fiction, Clark's World, and several short story anthologies. I count 88 published pieces of fiction, including short stories, novellas, novels, and 29 published poems. His new novel, Where the Axe is Buried, just came out a month ago and is available now. Ray is a man of the world, born in Canada, raised in the USA, and lived for several decades all around the world. He speaks several languages and has published work in English, French, and Czech. So yeah, he's an interesting guy, and we're excited to chat with him. Thanks for being here, Ray. Welcome.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Kevin.
Tell us how...
I should say
Yep.
right off the bat that I haven't written in anything but English. So,
Oh, you
uh,
haven't?
Mountain in the Sea's been published in over 12 languages now, which is really great, but all professionally translated by other people. I have translated some stuff from Russian into English. That's the only translation I've done. So I translated a story for Clark's World and a couple stories for Russian authors. I do speak Russian, but I would never dare actually write anything in
Well,
Russian.
that's what I was going to say, because it seems to me that would be really challenging as it not being your native language. But what languages do you speak?
So I speak Russian and I speak Spanish, and I have learned and forgotten many other languages, including Azerbaijani, Albanian, Turkmen, Tajik, Kyrgyz, Vietnamese, and a few others along
Holy.
the way. But I mean, I feel like I'm always very suspicious of people who say they speak 7 or 8 languages. Languages take an enormous amount of time to maintain.
Mm.
So unless you're just constantly reading and speaking, they go away pretty quickly, I've found.
Yeah, yeah.
A couple of years is usually enough to lose a lot of it, and then it takes weeks to get it back. So I really, on a day-to-day basis, I'm in Spanish language training right now, so I speak Spanish every day, and then I speak Russian at home with my wife and my daughter, so I get practice in that one all the time.
Okay. And I mean that was part of my question too, is, why all the languages? It's partly because you've lived in some of these places, right? Tell us a bit
Yeah,
about that.
yeah. So I was a Peace Corps volunteer in 2003 to 2005 in Turkmenistan, and then I stayed overseas for 2 decades, from 2003 until I came back to the U.S. in 2022. I had been back a few times to learn languages at the Foreign Service Institute. I was working with an international organization that did educational exchange programs, and then working for the State Department as a Foreign Service officer. And then my last couple tours, I was with NOAA, which is the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration here in the U.S. And then I was a visiting scholar at the George Washington University here in Washington. Um, and then from here, I'll go to the National Nuclear Risk Reduction Center, which is like the red phone for nuclear arms issues between Washington, D.C. and Moscow. It's like a 24/7 watch center.
That's fascinating. And that
Yeah.
that what an interesting perspective that would provide for you. Why would you be going to do that?
So I change jobs every couple of years. That's part of being a foreign service officer. My last few tours have been domestic, and this job came up on the radar, and I thought it would be a really interesting way to delve a little bit more into the sort of science and technology side of things. And then it fit for a lot of reasons. I want to keep my daughter in school here in DC for a while. I'd like her to, put down a few roots. We've been overseas a lot. She kind of spent her first 3 years in Kosovo, which was our last overseas tour. And I just wanted her to have a little bit of stability. So I thought I'd do a few tours back here in the US.
Oh,
Whereas, Nice and
Makes
stable.
makes good sense, and it sounds like excellent opportunity for research and participant observation for some new novels or some new
Yeah,
stories. Yeah,
maybe new
yeah,
material. I mean, material comes from everywhere. You never know. So.
that's true. That's true. So your writing career started while you were doing a lot of your work abroad. Is that right?
So I had written ever since I was maybe 16. I first started publishing when I think my first professional publication was when I was about 19. I was originally writing like crime stuff and like sort of noir and that sort of thing in the late 90s and early 2000s. I published in Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine and a few other places like that. Crime Wave in the UK, published a novella, and then I sort of dropped out because I went overseas. And back then, you couldn't really submit to anywhere from anywhere else. I mean, I'm sure you probably people struggle with it enough in Canada with the self-addressed stamped envelopes and that whole mess of trying to submit to US markets, but it was almost impossible to do any of that from like Turkmenistan.
Yeah.
So it wasn't until everyone kind of switched over finally to email. Everyone had been so resistant and to like online submissions that I started submitting again regularly. And so I had this kind of second career when I got the story Mutability published with Asimov's, and my career as like a science fiction writer started then. So I've had a long career in general of writing alongside everything I was doing. I've had a rather shorter and more intense career in science fiction starting about 2015.
So both Tristan and I have had the opportunity to read The Mountain in the Sea. Tristan has read Where the Axe is Buried, but neither of us have had the opportunity to read Tusks of Extinction, which of course was just nominated for the Hugo and the Nebula this year. Can you tell our listeners a bit about that story? And without spoilers, just kind of give us a sense of what that's all about.
Yeah, so the basic idea behind the tusks of extinction is there's an effort to bring back woolly mammoths, something that's pretty current and kind of in the atmosphere right now. But the problem is that the creatures that they bring back are not really woolly mammoths, and they don't know how to be woolly mammoths. And so they download the mind of the only scientist on Earth whose mind was stored 100 years ago, before she was killed doing her work in Africa. So she's the last person on Earth to have any experience with elephants. And so she's the person who would know the most about being an elephant. And they put her mind into the matriarch of this group of mammoths in order to teach them how to be mammoths, basically, how to survive. Um, that's I know that sounds really weird, but I swear that it seems to work.
Well, it sounds like it does. A lot of people are
Yeah.
talking about it. And so you got whole brain uploads, you've got genetic manipulation and cloning technology. I presume also a really good story.
Yeah, I'll definitely be picking that up sometime very soon.
Something that really stuck with me was there was an article that you co-wrote, I believe, or you mentioned this concept of writing as the opportunity for building rhetorical machines,
Hmm.
where and I see science fiction as a good opportunity for building rhetorical machines. What do you mean by that? What is that all about?
Well, I think science fiction has wonderful capacities for doing this thing that can be done in a lot of different kinds of writing, where you change something about the world. You're basically you're a good one way I would think about it is you are kind of turning dials up and down on different things. So, you think, I mean, these are all science, a lot of science fiction concepts are just someone going, okay, so there's two genders in the world. Well, what if there were nine, right? Like that would make things really complicated. Okay, so there's, you know, three or four different kinds of government on planet Earth. What if there were 12 of them? Or what if there was only one? Or, so you're kind of dialing things in. But I think the whole reason that you're doing that, I mean, I know that there is an aspect of science fiction which is predictive. I don't think it's actually very central to the genre. I think it's a bit of a sideline for science fiction writers in
Yeah.
general. I think mostly what we do is build these kind of worlds in order to look at the world that we are living in. I strongly feel that, for example, Philip K. Dick, his concerns were always with the present, right? It was really with, what is it like to be a human being? And then, like all of these sort of concerns, some of them pretty wild, but all of them really focused on his experience in the here and now. And he started using the future or using the past or using these other concepts in order to shine a light back on us. Um, I think Mary Shelley really gives in the preface to Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus, she gives a perfect description of science fiction that is just as valid today as when she, virtually invented the genre, right? I mean, of course, there's science fiction kind of before that, right? And it's, no genre truly traces its way, it's itself back to one thing. But I mean, Frankenstein would be a pretty good candidate for the birth of modern science fiction if you were gonna just pin it to one book. And she basically says that she knows that the concept is impossible, but what it does is it affords her a viewpoint on the human condition that would be impossible otherwise. And it allows her to explore these issues, these psychological and moral issues that she couldn't explore without this concept of bringing another, being into existence, of giving someone life. She says it a lot more eloquently, of course, and I kind of recommend that everybody go back and read it because although it is in this sort of fussy 18th century, fussy to us, 18th century language, it's extremely current. It explains to you exactly what it is that this genre does so well. It allows us to look at the human condition, from an interesting angle, from vistas, that just don't exist in what you call mundane fiction, right?
Hmm.
I mean, I
It's
also think the cool thing about science fiction is that it participates in what has been the mainstream of human storytelling since the beginning, which is that we've never constrained ourselves to this very narrow, secular, and, you know, um, sort of here and now stricture that is the way that one tells stories in the 20th century in literary fiction, right? We've always had myths and been expansive and had, gods and magic and all sorts of strange speculative aspects to our storytelling. So I think science fiction is less strange in many ways than literary fiction is.
hmm.
Literary fiction is really kind of like this little short-term blip in
Mhm.
human storytelling. Science fiction is a lot more connected to what we've been doing as a species for a much longer time.
So there's a concept that you touch on a little bit in Where the Axe is Buried. So I
Mhm.
just want to ask that question that you asked in your own book. Is writing action?
I think that writing has the potential to be action. I mean, I think when I hear people say, what good is writing and what does it ever change in the world? My response to that is, how many people do you think the protocols of the elders of Zion has killed, right? That's a good negative example of how writing is action. Like that's a book that murders people, right? And there have been others in history. And so I would say if you can find good examples of books that kill people, right? Books that when released into the environment are viral in some way in their ideas and can actually be destructive, then it must also be true that books can be restorative and have some kind of positive effect, and that people can change the way that they look at the world because of words. I mean, words are all we have. They're the entire construction of the castles in the air that we build and live in as human society, right? It's all made of language. And so if language isn't action, what is? How would you change people's opinions if it weren't for language? It's got to be. I think the proof is sort of there. Now, I mean, it has to be directed towards something in some way, directed or having some kind of effect, right? Like I don't know, what does the Lord of the Rings do in the world, right? I mean, I think like what kind of ideas does it put out there? How does it change people's sense of self? That's a little bit harder, to grasp maybe than some other things. But I think you could even come up with ideas like, what does Star Wars say about what it means to be a good person, right? Um, what do some of the, Pixar films say about friendship and loyalty and things like that? And what do they teach children about like what matters in the world? I mean, I think that even on this very commercial level, um, you can send out positive messages and guide people toward better ways of thinking, or do the opposite with words. So on the one hand, that's like my sort of yes, writing is action. On the other hand, um, I think it needs to be combined with other kinds of action, right? It has to be affected somehow. And I think I talk a little bit about that in Where the Axe is Buried, this idea that, the time for action is always now. Like you have to act and then argue about the results of that action, and then act and then argue. In in Buddhism, there's this concept, which I like, of you have an ox that pulls a cart, right? And if the ox pulls the cart all the time, right, then it gets tired and it gets sick and it runs out of energy. So the ox has to be taken to the mountain, needs to graze, be free, have some time to recover. But if the ox just lives on the mountain, it's not of any use to anyone, right? No one's pulling the cart. So you have to find a balance between pulling the cart and being on the mountain, right? In order to keep the ox healthy and in order to keep the cart moving forward. And without one or the other, you end up with a cart that doesn't go anywhere, right? And so I kind of see this intellectual activity as you move the ox to the mountain. But then there's other things that you need to do in order to make change, right? You can't just write and read books. There has to be some kind of activity that comes out of there. You need to be affected and change the way that you act in the world, right? And the way that you perceive the world. I think as parents, we see you see that more clearly in kids quite often. Like I was walking my daughter to school. They just did this Earth Day activity where they've been talking a lot about nature. And we walked out of the house and she was like, "Papa, it's so green out here." And I love that my birthday is at a time of the year when it's so green and the world is so full of life. And what a wonderful place. And I was thinking like, it's great that she's like she's thinking in this way. Like this is a wonderful, I'm glad that her school is encouraging her to think these way in this kind of open way about the world. So yeah, I mean, all of that is to say, it's a conversation, it's something I ask myself a lot. And I think the answer is both yes, and yes, but. It's not no.
Okay, glad to hear that the answer is not no. Um, for our listeners who have not read Where the Axe is Buried, can you give them an idea of what this book is about? I mean, we just talked a little bit about one kind of little idea from the book, and there's so much to unpack there. So there's so much going on. Yeah, tell us about Where the Axe is Buried.
Yeah, so Where the Axe is Buried, to put it very as succinctly as I can, is about the collapse of two systems. It is the collapse of a Western system that has decided to rely on artificial intelligences to guide its governments, and deconflict human desires to try to create more just societies, and how that starts to fail. And then on the other hand, it's about a autocratic society in which the president has been downloading his mind into successive bodies to maintain power. Sometimes in order to have himself assassinated and then reestablish control over the country when things start to go awry, and then in other ways to basically maintain a lock on power forever. Both of these systems are about surveillance and very invasive practices of one kind or another. But the book, I feel like, operates from a ground level And what you see is what you might see as a person living through the collapse of these systems. So you don't get this kind of God's eye view of the world ending. Instead, you get a very, I feel like, human view of what it would feel like to go through collapse. And there are positive things that can come out of collapse. So I don't feel like it's, I know the book has been very much labeled a dystopia. I disagree with that label, because I think the book is much more hopeful than that. And I wouldn't write a dystopia. I'll say that up front. It's not that I think dystopias don't have aren't interesting or don't have value, but I would never write a dystopia myself. I'm not a dystopian author. And so this is not that. But it has been labeled that because it's dark, right? It's dark and and it's about, the struggle to kind of get through um the end of systems.
Right. So I'm gonna pull out a quote here, and just before we started recording, I did say I find it interesting that you're living in Washington D.C. on the
Hmm.
front lines, in
Hmm.
many respects, and when you read Where the X is Buried, it almost seemed like you had written this book just a few weeks ago, like, or that, you've probably been working on it for a couple of years, yet it just seems to align. And I know that can happen. We have books from 100 years ago that might seem relevant today. But just one quote I want to pull up here is a government is no longer a thing to be annoyed at, to see inadequacies in, but something to fear. Yeah, that's dark. Is
Hmm.
that where we're at right now?
When I was a Peace Corps volunteer, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Turkmenistan, and Turkmenistan was a full authoritarian state with the president at the time was um, Saparmurat Niyazov, who had renamed himself Turkmenbashi, father of all Turkmen, right? Had absolute control over every aspect of people's lives. Everybody walked around with little golden pins with the president's face on them. There was a rotating golden statue of the president that turned to face the sun. And the joke was that it's not the statue that turns to face the sun. Right? That was the joke that they would tell. Um, and it was a society filled with fear, um, in which the whims of one man became law as soon as he decided to say them. And Turkmenbashi would get on television. One moment he got on television and he would just sort of ramble, right? And he started rambling. He said, you know, um, this girl came up to me the other day and at a concert in my honor, and she smiled, and I saw that she had all these gold teeth. And it's sort of been a Turkmen tradition to have your gold teeth. If you got a crown or something, and they had a lot of dental problems for nutritional reasons and other things. So a lot of people have gold teeth, right? Um, and uh, and I thought he said I looked at her and I thought, my dog doesn't have any gold teeth. Um, People shouldn't have gold teeth. It's ugly. I don't like it. And within about a week, my students at the university where I was teaching, all of whom had some number of gold teeth, had all their crowns replaced, right? And they all came in with like swollen, like faces, having had perfectly good crowns torn off and replaced with porcelain crowns because they were told by the school administration that if they did not do that, they would be expelled from the university. And things like this would just happen all the time. I used to go to my classroom, which was like in the basement of the university, and I would find the hallway dark, and I would knock on the door and say like, "It's me," and my students would be like, "Okay," and they would unlock the door and they'd say, "Sorry, we're hiding because the dean is roaming the halls looking for students to force to join this parade, right? And go stand in a stadium and wait for the president to come, and we don't want to go." I had two students who they both spoke amazing English, but one of them looked like the ideal Turkmen beauty, and the other one looked too Iranian, but her English was slightly better. And they used to have the Turkmen looking girl that fit all of their sort of physical ideals stand at the microphone while the other one read the English speech from behind a curtain, right? Um, and there were darker things. I mean, there were journalists. There was a journalist that I met in Washington, D.C., who had written some critical articles about the regime. And he was taken out to a graveyard on the edge of the city where he was forced to dig a hole for himself. And then he was beaten half to death and thrown into the hole and told the next time, they wouldn't spare him, right? People were killed, and people disappeared. So that's all to say that and after that, I lived in Russia in 2008, watching Putin's rise. I lived in Kazakhstan, which was another authoritarian state being run more like a family business, right? A little bit lighter on the brutality, but still without any real freedom. I lived in Azerbaijan, where the dictatorship has been passed off from father to son. So I have the experience of having lived under many authoritarian uh, states in different forms, and especially having been in Turkmenistan, that left a real impact. So I know what it looks like to lose your freedoms completely, and I know that life continues to go on without them, and it's not a life that you want to have. And there's going to be a tipping point somewhere where you can't go back anymore, and you're in the hole and the gravitational you're in the gravity hole, and it's going to take some massive amount of power to get up out of it. um, I don't think that any Western countries are there yet, um, but I do think that we make a few intellectual mistakes which we ought to watch out for, and one really common one is we think everyone who existed before us is dumber than we are, right? Like everyone in the past is dumber than we are. All those Germans, right, in the 1920s and 30s, well, they don't know what we know, right? Well, they're no dumber than we are. And they had been through a lot of political systems. They'd seen a lot. They knew a lot. They were reading a lot of the same books that we're reading now. Most of human knowledge was around for them, just the way it is for us. And they made a lot of mistakes. And they crossed a lot of goalposts, went down, past a lot of points of maybe, that weren't points of no return yet until they got to where they got. And that's a mistake, to think that we know better. Another mistake that we make is to think that there's these like people of the West, right, who have these sophisticated, complex, and hardy systems, and then there's people of the East who are prone to authoritarianism, and that's just the natural way of things. And so it's different if you're Russian or you're Chinese or something like that, and we're never going to be where they are. You've got to you've got to realize how fragile systems can be, and how much they can be damaged very, very quickly. um, and you've got to be vigilant about those things. So, I mean, all that is to say, uh, I do not like false parallels, right? We are not Turkmenistan, and we don't have their history. We're not a weak republic that rose out of the Soviet Union and never had any experience with democracy and then collapsed back into authoritarianism. We're not those things. None of our countries are those things. We're not a country that was destroyed by World War I and is facing 1,000% and plus inflation and watching its economy collapse with, unemployment rates well above 50%. And that invites a certain kind of, authoritarian possibilities that don't exist normally. Um, but I think democracy has to be about some kind of vigilance, right? I mean, I think if you look historically at democracy, right, um, it's really interesting to read anything about Athens and all the struggles that it went through trying to find balances, and how do you do democracy right? Who gets to vote? How do you who gets to lead? All those problems. A lot of the problems we face right now are problems that they faced in one form or another. And I think if you wanted a really good example, what like a in some ways the perfect example of democracy for me in Athens was this moment when the Athenians realize that the Persians are about to land at Marathon. And they go up to the Pnyx, which is where they would take their votes, thousands of them, right? Most of the citizens of Athens, very small state, so there's only maybe 6 or 7 thousand citizens at the time. And they have to take a vote on whether they're going to go and meet the Persians on the beach or whether they're going to try to find some other solution. And they vote, and people vote yay and they vote nay. And when the vote comes out and it's yes, right? They all put their armor on and they go to the beach and they take the consequences of the decision that was made. And they have to stand shoulder to shoulder, right? Because that's how the phalanx works. And if the person next to you isn't with you in that moment, you die, right? And so everybody has to be together in those things. But before that moment of solidarity, there had to be this wonderful democratic moment of total argument at the Pnyx, right? When all of these people who knew the consequences of what they were about to do were in heated discussion about what was going to happen next. And so I think we need to be fully engaged, right? And the problem is to come back to those questions. The problem has always been in the West, I think, that people think democracy is a game. We live in a totally abstracted society where we feel like we can just watch things occur through a screen and they aren't going to happen to us, right? And they're not happening in some real world. We're very, very incapable of realizing that we are present in this world and that this world will have consequences. The Athenians didn't have that luxury. They knew they were going to put the armor on and go to the beach and take the consequence of action of the vote, right? Turn it into action and have to do it together and take the consequence. We think there won't be any consequences, that it's like a football game, right? And that's a big problem.
Mm-hmm. And those arguments that need to happen are happening over each other's shoulders or in separate echo chambers. And
Yeah.
so they're not fulsome arguments as they might have been in the Athenians' time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. They're not happening. And so bad decisions are being made and people think they can escape the consequences of those bad decisions. And that's just not an acceptable an attitude to have about democracy. Democracy ought to be hard work
Mm-hmm.
and it ought to involve having lots of conversations with people you don't agree with.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not finding ourselves in rooms with people we don't agree with. And we're not finding ourselves with the respect that's needed to have those conversations or the common ground that's needed to sustain them.
Mm-hmm. And I think that Ray, that was a unique perspective that you bring to that response is one that should be listened to. And I certainly appreciate that as perspective on authoritarian regimes and on democracy because it's one that's well informed, I believe. And also, it sounds as though that's been brought to bear on Where the Axe is Buried. And I'm looking forward to reading that one. Okay, so let's move on to The Mountain in the Sea, your first novel. Um, could I trouble you to tell our listeners a bit about that book to give it some background?
Yeah, so The Mountain in the Sea is about a group of scientists on the Condal Archipelago, which is a real archipelago off the coast of Vietnam, who believe they have discovered a sentient and communicative um, species of octopus. Um, and sentient is the least important part because really sentience is pretty widespread in the animal kingdom, but this is a species of octopus that communicates with symbols, and that means that we might be able to communicate with them. So it's a bit of a first contact story, but takes a more of a hard science, where the hard science is biology approach to first contact, and then also uses that lens to explore a lot of other things.
Agreed. And you explored concepts of first contact, obviously, with an Earth-born alien species in essence, because it's so unhuman-like. And I think you took pains to paint them and to not as non-human and not to anthropomorphize. Talk a bit about octopus motivations or lack of our ability to understand them.
I mean, I think one of the things that I was trying to take very seriously is that our sense of meaning is very embodied, right? We think our minds are very connected to our physical structures. We sort of in the modern era where everything's very mitigated by technology, we don't think about these things a lot, about how much of meaning really has to do with how we're built. But think about it this way. When you say to someone, "Oh, well, why didn't you stand up to him?" You know, um, why do you like? I mean, a lot of our metaphors for things, right, are physical metaphors, right? Like, why are you, like everything has to do with really the way that we are in the world. So all creatures that are communicating out of that whatever their physical structure is. And the octopus is interesting because it's both quite alien, but also has a lot in common with us. It's a tool user that can manipulate things with its arms. It walks rather than swims most of the time. It has eyes that are a lot like ours, but it has this brain and neural structure that are also completely different. And I think what's interesting about the octopus is, if you were an alien species and you landed on planet Earth and you found two intelligent species this different, I think you would be really curious about how you ended up with a planet so rich that it managed to produce across like this wide spectrum of life using two completely different structures, two animals that were so fantastically curious and smart in their own ways, right? And then other animals, of course, that are all around us that are doing very cool things too.
Not only are you looking at consciousness perhaps in sentient octopuses, but also in AI. So you explore the concepts of sentience in AI. The most fascinating one in the book to me were um, the anima slaver fishing ships that were such an interesting concept. Dennis E. Taylor talks about the problem of AI misalignment and the paperclip problem, where, if
Mm.
you program an AI to make paperclips, it's going to destroy the universe to try to make paperclips. And here's a fascinating subplot of the book where you explore that concept. Um, that I mean, talk about misalignment, but also dystopian alignment with capitalism.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've always seen, so if you want to talk about AI structures, right? Like we build these structures that manipulate us as parts of themselves a lot. And one of the really good examples is corporations, right? So, corporations are these kind of immortal beings that have a certain set of parameters that they're supposed to operate from legally, like they're defined in these ways that sort of cycle through human bodies, right? Like that they're composed of. But in the end, they're, these entities that alter the way that we live in the world. And they are kind of, a form of AI. They don't have sentience. Their sentience is distributed throughout whatever humans they happen to be using and structured by the laws that govern them. Their activities, right, are that. But sentience is not really the most important question for me. Like, the question is, and the question, and where the axe is buried, is not like whether the prime ministers that have been installed are conscious. It's what is the effect of what they're doing, and is their activity actually beneficial to humankind? And that's really the kinds of questions we should be asking about things like corporations, right? And so, yeah, you have this fishing vessel. It's captained by an AI. it decides that humans are cheaper to maintain than robots. And so it gets rid of the robots that it was using to fish and it replaces them with human slaves. That's a really good, sensible decision. Human beings are self-replicating, self-repairing largely, right? And can be obtained cheaply. And so, it decides that that's a better way to maximize profit, right? And minimize expenses. And
Mhm.
those are the kinds of calculations that corporations are making, right? All over the world. Um, which is why we always have, I think, this dangerous balance in our societies between corporate and business activities and capitalism and democracy on the other hand, the other side. And that's not to completely villainize capitalism, right? But that's to say that there is this necessary equilibrium between the democratic side of arguing how things ought to work and the capitalist side of, engaging with the world, producing things that people need, doing things and how you're going to do that thing and how it's going to be regulated, how much you take, what are responsible for,
Mhm.
etc. And this is a good, for me, it was a good way to explore like what happens when all you are left with is the command set of maximize profit, extract maximum protein from the sea as cheaply as possible. I was a little bit inspired by Logan's Run, actually. And this is something I've never talked about. So the first time, right, that
The
I'll
scoop.
talk about it is
Great.
here.
Oh, you're
Huh?
gonna mention the robot that says the
Yeah,
plankton and oh.
yes, exactly. So that is actually one of the sort of origins. Yeah, fish, plankton, and protein from the sea, right? It's this robot
Yes.
that has this command to
What
like get protein. I forget the name of the robot. It actually has
I
a
was
name.
just thinking of the
Um,
name. I can't
yeah.
look it up.
But I loved Logan's Run as a kid, which was on reruns on like UHF channels when I was growing up all the time, which I watched and was like horrified by and also just like fascinated with. And yeah, I think that the AI mind on board the fishing vessel is kind of inspired by that sense that you're given a command, right? And you have to carry it out, and then you start just carrying it out on whatever happens to pass by, no matter what the
Mhm.
consequence is.
And to say that it's evil is a very human concept because that's a human morality, right?
Right.
So that's why this concept of AI alignment is such a salient one right now, and in particular in that story that you wrote. I like the concept of that sentience is not that important. It's more about can an entity action on the world, its agency, right? Because
Mm.
if you're a slave on the Sea Wolf, this AI ship, you don't care whether that AI is sentient or not, but it sure as hell has control over you and your life. So its agency is what really matters.
Right.
It's a really fascinating concept that you bring up.
That's a concept that Peter Watts plays with too, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's true.
Especially in Blindsight.
Yeah,
Yeah. That's
consciousness. Yep.
Consciousness,
yeah.
right?
That for me, it's returning a little bit to that 19th century pragmatism, right? Like the sum total of what we ought to be concerned about is the result. It's not like the thoughts in someone's head, but what actions they carry out. I love that Charles Sanders Peirce has this theory of belief that I feel like is perfect. And it sounds like something you want to argue with, but the more you carry it around with yourself, the more you realize that it's perfect. What he says is a belief is an idea that a person is willing to act upon.
I like that.
And you start picking at it, you'll start kind of like, believe me, if you you'll start picking at it and you realize it can't really be picked at. Because if you're not willing to act upon it, it's probably not a belief. You might just be fooling yourself into thinking that it was, right?
Right. It
It's
needs to be strongly held enough that you're
mm,
willing to go out and do a thing about it, for sure.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, exactly. And if you're not acting on it, it's probably because you don't believe it,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
Hmm.
Interesting.
So, so yeah, I mean, that's what I'm interested in when we talk about AI. I'm interested in AI's effect upon the world, right? What is the effect? Not like is AI going to be sentient? I mean, I think I use that concept in the mountain and the sea, but it's really again to turn a lens back on our own consciousness, right? People ask me sometimes, when do I think something like Evrim the AI powered, Android in the Mountain and Sea would be possible? My answer is never.
Why never?
Given our current trajectory in AI, the answer is never. Um, and that's a good thing. And also, it's when you think about it, it's a bit silly in a sense, right? Because as soon as something became actually sentient, the same way that we are, it would cease to be useful as something we had built to serve us, right?
Is
So you don't want sentient androids because when you get sentient androids, like in Blade Runner, right? All they are is slaves that you have to control and like murder, right? What you want is non-sentient problem-solving things that you can use as tools to drive your own agency, right? And that you can fully control. So there's that we're not you probably shouldn't be looking to turn anything into a mind, right? You should be looking to turn it into an incredibly complex data processor that's capable of sifting the world the way you want, but that is fully under your control and isn't thinking about anything, which is
so
what
that's
AI is right now.
that's why you're saying we probably wouldn't have an Evrim like sentient AIs because we wouldn't want to produce that.
Well, we can't produce it, I would
Right.
say. I mean, these
Right.
are long arguments, right? But I think we can't produce it. We're not on track to produce it. The way that AI works is not anything like how a mind would work. The way that nature made minds and the reasons it made minds that have consciousness are complex and buried in billions of years of evolution. And they have to do with movement in the world, not with mathematical problem solving and logic gates and that kind of thing. So there's just a ton of different reasons why that wouldn't happen. And it's not like I don't believe that consciousness is a process that emerges from logic gate algorithmic, adjacency activities and that kind of thing, which is basically where we're at with AI. You would have to start back over, and you would basically have to do what life did, put little self-replicating things in situations where they had to solve problems in order to replicate themselves, and they would eventually grow minds over billions of years. And what would be the point of that?
Hmm.
Right.
Yeah, right. Well, some computer scientists might talk about evolutionary or genetic algorithms and say, "Hey, we're working on that."
Yeah. And I mean, I guess I would always say like, why, and good
Yeah.
luck.
No, no, I hear you. I hear you. Okay, so we would love to hear about what you're working on. To whatever extent you can talk about it, love to know what you're up to, and what are we going to see from Ray next?
So I have just finished I think I'm about to finish the second draft of the next book. I have sold it to the publisher along with a short story collection. So you will see a short story collection from me um, in the near future. I don't know which one's going to come first, and another novel. It will be different from anything that I've written before because I don't want to write the same book twice. But I do like what my agent said to me. I thought my agent, Seth Fishman, he's a wonderful person. And he read the book and he said, what I love about you is none of your books are the same, but I do feel like you provide your readers with this like pathway through your books. So that they're never going to feel like this is just something completely different from everything before. And I don't like it doesn't seem like something Ray Nayler would write. Um, but you can do that while being so very different, right? That it's fascinating how you can build that bridge. And I thought that's a great compliment, and I hope that's true. So I feel that way. I feel like there's a pathway into this book from where the axe is buried, the mountain and the sea, but it is very different. It is, for example, not in the future.
Mm, okay.
And that's about all I'm probably going to say about
All
that.
right.
Exciting. Ray, Box, the
Box.
the name of the
Yes.
robot for Logan's Run.
Yes. Yeah.
Box.
Yeah, exactly. Box just freaked me out when I was a kid.
Me too.
Yes,
Me
scared the
too.
crap out of me.
Yeah. And then there was a naked girl right after Box. So and then I was like, okay. I wasn't supposed to see that, Dad.
Right.
Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Ray. That was awesome. We're definitely going to talk to Ray again in the future because that was a lot of fun, and there's so much more to talk about. What do you think of Logan's Run? What do you think of Box? Good movie? One of the best, isn't it? Thank you for joining us. Until next time.